Introduction. It's good to be here, and I hope the course is going well for you so far. As already been mentioned, I'm here to give you basically an overview of the changing landscape of security on the continent. And I should say, first of all, to start off, I'm not the expert here, but you are. The experts in African security are obviously people like you. What I'm going to give you is the view of a curious outsider who has studied the continent for a long time and studied security and other trends along with it. And what I want to do is address what I think are the 5 key questions that revolve, or all questions or all debates about security at the conceptual level or the practical policies have to address and give answers to these 5 core questions. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is obviously what is security? And what we mean by security here, I would say there's a number of different answers we can give, and it depends really on our political values and our political theories. Everybody agrees at base that security is about protecting us and our cherished values from various types of threats. But that in and of itself doesn't tell us a great deal. Really, how we define our cherished values and what we think counts as threats to them is really all based on our political theories, our political ideologies, and our political values. And broadly speaking, as I put up here, you'll find 3 ways to answer that question, what is security? One view talks about security as being synonymous with power. We are secure when we're powerful enough to dominate other actors. And security rolls through that power relationship. If we have power over others, we can feel secure. They might feel insecure, but we can feel secure. A second approach, though, would say that's not the best way to think about security. Real, true security comes in cooperation with other actors. Both actors will be able to feel more secure if they work in cooperative relationships with one another to achieve mutually beneficial ends. And yet there's a third view that sees security actually as synonymous, in the English language at least, with emancipation. It's about justice. And that I cannot be truly secure until you are all truly secure as well. And really the pursuit of security is actually the pursuit of things like justice, human rights, and emancipation. So that first set of questions is all about what do we think this concept means and how are we trying to achieve it. The second question is about the referent objects of security. And this has really changed dramatically over time, particularly in the last 15, 20 years or so. Whose security are we talking about? Who is the primary referent object of our security theories and our security policies? And here again, you can find a range of different answers. Are we talking about the state and its security? Or are we talking about more narrowly the regime or a particular government security? Because that's not the same thing as national security. Are we talking about the security of particular communities, whether we define them in ethnic terms or religious terms, or in geographic terms, northerners as opposed to southerners, easterners as opposed to westerners? Or are we talking, as Tom mentioned before, about ordinary people? Is it the security of ordinary citizens that we should be focused on most as our priority? And more recently still, ecological and environmental issues have become much more important. What does it mean as human beings? What does it mean to have to live and depend on an ecological system and the biosphere, that if we adopt certain policies that degrade the environment, no one will have true security? So that second big question is about whose security are we talking about, and depending how we answer that, our security theories and our security policies are going to look very different indeed. The third big question then is about what is our principal threat agenda? Depending what we think security means and whose security we're talking about, what are the principal threats that we have to deal with? And as Tom mentioned, my focus here has been on Africa for a long time. I think if we look at the African continent over the last couple of decades, 4 bundles or 4 baskets of threats seem to be particularly important. First, obviously, political violence in all its different forms. But also, if we think about more health and also government and national security related issues, health concerns and health challenges have obviously been crucially important. Not just the Ebola that we're talking about recently, but obviously HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and all sorts of other types of infectious diseases have had a huge impact on Africa's populations. The third basket of issues, I would say again, is to do with the environment and ecological sustainability. And then the fourth basket, again, which is probably becoming more prominent in the last couple of decades rather than less, criminal activity. And not just individual acts of banditry and theft, but more the sort of organised transnational criminality that involves the trafficking of weapons, small arms and light weapons, the trafficking of humans, the trafficking of illicit resources, drugs, and other types of organised criminal activities. Once we've got our threat agendas, how can these be alleviated? How can we actually solve the challenges and the threats that confront us? And here again, the answers are open to debate. There's no consensus about how to deal with these different challenges. What I would suggest is there's a sort of menu of options there. Are we best dealing with our security challenges through employing military power? Or alternatively, are the solutions to our security challenges, do they really lie with politics and governance structures? If we get our politics and our governance right, is that really going to be the best way to solve our security challenges? Or is it development? Are our major problems springing from underdevelopment, poverty, and massive inequality between groups and people? In which case, development policies that enable growing and rising levels of equality, as well as economic growth and sustainability, may well be key to solving our problems. Is it about institution building? Or are we okay with the actors and institutions that we currently have? Or are our security threats really going to need new institutions or major reforms of our current ones? And multilateralism, I think it doesn't even need debating much anymore. No one can do this alone. No one can solve these security threats and their agendas alone. So really the only game in town is multilateralism. How do we partner for security? Which partners do we need, and what skills do we all need to bring to the table for those partnerships to work? And then that leads us to the final big question about who are the agents of security? Who can actually deliver this agenda? Who can deliver these goals and objectives that we're talking about here? And obviously very relevant for your course here today, is it soldiers? Is it police? Is it civilians? Is it all three? And if it's all three, what should the relationship between these groups be? Who should lead? But it's also not just about civil, military and policing dimensions. There's also a big issue about what I call here locals and foreigners. What should the relationship between insider, local actors and foreign actors be when it comes to solving our security challenges? How and when can foreigners play a constructive role in resolving these threats that we face? And finally, what about the relationship at home between governments and domestic groups, civil society actors and other types of domestic associations? What's the right balance and division of labour between these groups when it comes to solving these issues? So I would say, hopefully, in sort of one slide, that's how I see the evolution of the security landscape over the last couple of decades. And it hinges really on your answers to those 5 key questions. It doesn't really hinge on my answers to those, although I've told you what I think, and I will say a bit more about what I think. But it really depends on you, your institutions that you work for, the governments that you serve, and also the wider populations who are going to decide whether they think your government is legitimate or illegitimate. Are they going to support it, or are they going to resist and work against it? This is basically the problems we're grappling with here. Now, what I think that leads to is that it means that security is all about politics, really. Although we often try to talk about the technical side of security policies, as Tom mentioned, what equipment, materiel might we need? Really, security is all about politics. And as I put up here on this slide, politics means that we see security in different ways, and we see threats and problems and challenges in different ways. The way that I as an academic see them, the way that you as military or police practitioners see them, the way that governments see them compared to ordinary citizens. And what this means is nobody's security or threat agenda is ever really completely the same, because we prioritize things in different ways. We define different issues as the problem. What is the key security threat that we are trying to deal with? And that's because we have different political values. We also define then very different instruments to deal with these things. What do we think is the best instrument to use in our toolbox to address these issues, the military, the police, the civilian, whatever it might be? And I think one of the sources of tension in contemporary debates about security is precisely this type of different set of threat agendas. When, for example, a foreign power like the United States or Britain or France or Portugal or Italy or whoever it is, when they come to security issues in Africa, they're not always thinking about security in the same way as the locals. They're prioritizing different threats and challenges, and that's where they want to channel their resources, their money, their personnel, and their effort. And when that doesn't match local threat agendas and local priorities, this is when we start seeing politics really play out. Now, there's no way of getting around this. Security is about politics. It's about having frank and open discussions about our political commitments, our political priorities, and what instruments, what tactics, if you like, we can use to best overcome the challenges that we face. And if we could get more and more of our security threat agendas actually agreeing on the same priorities, the politics would be a lot easier. What we face at the moment, though, a lot of times is that we don't all agree on the priorities we're facing, so we often talk past each other. Or we may nod and smile to the Americans or the British or the Italians. Of course, yes, we'll work on counter-terrorism issues, we'll work on this transnational criminal stuff. But if it's not addressing the fundamental security problems that you feel you're facing as locals, this will lead to big political problems. Now, I think the biggest political problem facing Africa in the short term, I know I talked about health and environmental and criminal issues, and they are all important, but I think the short-term problem that we face that really has a problematic knock-on effect for all the other issues are still questions of political violence. And obviously political violence is not equally spread across the African continent. The good news is, as you know better than me, for the last couple of decades we've seen big reductions in the level of political violence. But there's also certain parts of the continent where these things have become very deeply ingrained, protracted, even endemic. And so we're struggling with the knock-on effects of all these. Now, I understand we'll hear more about the different types of violence facing the continent. You know, I put up my list here of the types of different problems we might face, whether it's civil wars, complex interlocking wars in places like the Sudans or Somalia or Eastern DR Congo, whether it's military coups, whether it's massacres of non-combatants and civilians or terrorist acts that deliberately target non-combatants, or it's the world of non-state armed conflicts, sub-clans fighting other sub-clans in Somalia, cattle raiding taking place in parts of South Sudan, whatever the case may be, electoral-related violence or livelihood struggles related to environmental issues, water access, grazing access for livestock herds, these types of things. And the problem I think we've had, or not necessarily the problem, but what we've seen, I think, develop over the last 2 decades or so in Africa in particular, is a series of arguments about whose security should we really be focusing on. And of course, all the studies and all the rhetoric is about national security. That's the key focus. It's governments and states that we should be doing these for, and it's governments and states that we should listen to define those threat agendas. But I think a big part of the problem in contemporary Africa, not all the continent, but I would say at least probably a couple of dozen countries in the continent, we've been talking about national security, but what we've really been doing is regime security. And there's a big, big difference between protecting a particular regime or a particular government or even one political party. That's very different than trying to do genuinely national security. Challenging those people who just want regime security, you've had, as Tom mentioned, people who say we need to put individual humans, the human security agenda, at the front of our thinking and the front of our policies. And what you've seen really is a big series of struggles and fights and conflicts between proponents of regime security, who want to keep the status quo and the regime in power, and they want that regime to survive, versus its opponents, who are arguing about a different type of security, vested in the individual. I think, just to make the situation even more complicated, eventually, and I don't know how long it will take, we're all going to have to talk much more about ecological security. If we ruin the environment in which we live, no humans are going to be secure. And so ultimately we need to think about how can humans, regimes, communities and states live in a sustainable manner with the environment that we've been given. and that we've got to look after. Now, penultimately, you'll see here some of these characters you will recognize more than others, but this is a list of some of Africa's longest standing leaders in recent times. And you'll see I put up there the various red X's for the leaders that have now left. But I think, unfortunately, these images, well, you've lost some, but you don't need English, French, or Portuguese to understand this. These leaders here on the continent, the numbers I've put on their foreheads are how long they've been in power in their own countries, either before they left or they're still going if there's no red X there. You've been talking a lot about leadership, and unfortunately, I think a lot of these people could potentially be part of the security solutions, but more often, I'm going to test you on them later as to who they all are, but more often, they are an increasing part of the security problem. These are the faces of the people who are pushing the regime security agenda. And that's not the same as national security. That's not the same as human security, but these are the guys, and they're all guys, obviously, that are most interested in pushing that particular version of security. I don't think it's sustainable. I think it's counterproductive, ultimately, to focus on regime security, and the recent events in the Arab world since 2011 give us one indication of why. Now, where this leaves us, I think, and what I think is the problem of these not just these, but these gentlemen who are largely in the business of regime security, is that their version of thinking about security and practicing security is undermined and counterproductive for a number of reasons, and I'll stop after this, but you will have presumably all discussed these things already. Regime security tends to degenerate over time. The longer you focus on your primary goal being just the survival of your regime, the more these challenges start to affect it. Corruption seeps in. You start to commit human wrongs and human rights abuses in the name of your regime security. You start to think in zero-sum terms. It's us versus them. It's not that we're all Ethiopians or Ugandans or Somalis together. We think rather in us and them terms. We're in charge. They have to deal with the brunt of this. It leads to exclusionary and group types of thinking. Groupthink being the idea that our advisors increasingly tell us what we want to hear, instead of telling us what leaders need to hear, an accurate and frank assessment of the security challenges. Groupthink leads to fear amongst our own side. It leads us to stop challenging ideas that our leaders pass down. And finally, we get into militarization. We try and defend the regime at all costs, usually by using military instruments. And as I've hopefully demonstrated already, the military is one instrument that, of course, is useful sometimes for dealing with our security threats. But the big issues we're going to have to deal with are not going to be solved through military means, whether it's environmental or health issues, certainly, but also, as Tom mentioned, that broader set of security challenges around crime and various types of political violence. We're going to need police and justice and customs systems much more probably than we're going to need traditional military. And I'll leave it there. Okay. Thank you.